Eric.
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah, buddy?
Buddy?
It's like when you're questioning your existence, but you still want to be positive. Like there's, yeah, buddy, an affirmation. There's the declaration, which then you'll yell it out loud.
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah. And then there's the, I'm not so sure, but I'm going to put it out there.
Yeah, buddy.
Exactly. Folks, and I do say folks because we're in the great state of Texas. We met Ronnie Coleman. Like we actually met Ronnie Coleman. We had a chance to interview him, interact with him, hang out, observe him in his gym that he has attended for over, I think it's now 30 years. I think he started in what, 93?
Yeah.
Early 90s.
Maybe even earlier. No. I want to say 91.
It's before he got into shows. So there's
because Brian Dobson is the one who got him into competing. Yeah.
Cannot believe it happened. I'm still in awe. And I just want to state that I was pleasantly surprised, and I'm thrilled that we actually went ahead and got the chance. I want to give the biggest shout out to Big J of Big J's Extreme Fitness for organizing all of this. He was a true friend where we reached out. The concept we had discussed, what's the feasibility of it? We're already coming to Texas. Wow, how cool would that be? And we all had this respect for Ronnie. We had witnessed, various things on social media, like him interacting with people and his time being busy and numerous things having occurred since his reign as 8-time Mr. Olympia. But the amount of time he gave us, the answers that he gave us, which you'll see in the documentary, he was just very generous. And even like the whole photos where we took it and everything else, like it was just cool, man.
Yeah, no, I just want to echo that. And again, I just want to say also a big shout out to Big J as well as Brian Dobson and just the whole Metroflex crew. We had expectations of basically just kind of going there and checking out the vibe, maybe training at Metroflex, and those were exceeded. I mean, I expressed before this happened in the pre-episode my excitement for interviewing Ronnie and getting to meet him at all. And it was awesome when it actually happened. And it wasn't something that I was for sure thinking was going to happen. So big shout out to Ronnie for giving us the time. Certainly didn't have to. Big thanks to Big J for making those asks on our behalf. Certainly didn't have to. And big thanks to Brian for giving us a lot of his time. Oh, yeah, a tremendous amount of really giving us the history and giving us a true feeling. I think to the best ability that he could. Of what that era was and what is central to that community. So it was a really cool experience for me.
I'm like cards on the table. I thought this was a Hansel and Gretel situation in which you lured me from Ireland with the promises of meeting Ronnie Coleman. Driving down to Arlington, I was skeptical, scared, suspicious. Just my general demeanor. I mean, like
the Airbnb that we stayed at, that was kind of some straight saw shit right there.
A little bit. I mean,
a little bit. Door locked behind us.
Yeah, automatic door lock. But as a historian, something that I try and tell people, like why should we study the history of strength, history of fitness, history of bodybuilding, etc. It's you get an appreciation for people's stories, people's lives, and how they can impact the present. It was amazing hearing Ronnie talk. It was amazing hearing Brian talk. It was amazing hearing Big J talk, and how everyone has their unique understandings and experiences and interactions with a space, and how they come together to create something on top of that. So it was magical to me because I study dead people who are usually half naked. That always gets a lot of looks in an archive. So it's nice to talk to the living for once. Really drug that one down. I'm so sorry.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with being really interested in naked dead people. I think is what you're saying, Connor. Am I putting words in your mouth?
No. I mean,
that's what you said.
The deader, the nakeder, the better. But in a cool way, like not in a creepy way.
Not in a weird way.
Not in a weird way. No, it's like it's research.
Can I just say that
no necro.
Like this documentary has been, sometimes it certainly feels like work, but it's kind of like, as we've been reminded and as I've always heard, that if you do something with passion, you'll never work a day in your life.
And truer words were never said about this trip to Metroflex.
The new yeah, buddy. Well, hey, first I want to ask Connor and then kick it over to you, Eric, because story time, folks. 2013, I actually had the opportunity and the privilege to go to Metroflex. Big J was gracious enough to take us there. We were there for several hours. And honestly, this time when we went in 2023, it was busier. Yeah. When we went right around the same time, and I did stay for about 3 to 4 hours, I want to say, because we trained, full training session, spoke to Brian. I have my impressions, which I want to hear from you guys. And then going back, it actually made me happy to see, because here's the thing. It is definitely a hardcore gym, and we can classify exactly what that means. The promotion is its reputation, not any actual active promotion. There is, as Brian said, the Instagram. It kind of reminds you of there's this pizzeria, Danforth Pizza House in Toronto, where they had no telephone number, they had no website with the advent of the internet and so forth. But you just had to be in the know. But it had a dedicated fan base that would go there, and you would hear, like the classical way, word of mouth. So, anyways, to see it a decade later, and I don't know the inner workings, but as I heard it, they're doing their thing in 2013. It seems like they're almost doing better now, and that might be the resurgence of Ronnie's popularity, his reputation, or the reputation of Metroflex, what Brian has done. It was just cool to see, but I do want to hear first from Conor, actually, as a historian, as someone who's gone to a lot of different gyms, as someone who has studied some of these things, that knows the history of either Ronnie trained there, Branch Warren, just hardcore gyms and what they represent in comparison to the space at the time and now in a contemporary setting. All those things swirling around your head, as you said, you usually are taking a look with the lens backwards in time, and you went to a place where it's kind of the intersection of all these things, right? It has a history, and then it has a present, and then perhaps there is a future to be told, and then you're participating in it by being there. Like, what did it feel like? Just walk us through, if you can, Conor, your experience then of Metroflex and everything.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the personal, and then I'm going to go into the professional, the one that my wife hates, because I'm like, well, actually, no, this area, anywho. On a personal level, this was an incredible thing to see, because Brian has captured a certain atmosphere, a certain culture, a certain spirit within that gym that is very obvious when you go in. And I think there is obviously, every gym has its own ecosystem, every gym has its own culture, etc. It did not disappoint me. As someone who watched all of Branch's videos, all of Ronnie's videos, watched The King, has watched interviews with Brian, has read about the place, it really did live up to its reputation. I love dungeon gyms, spit and sawdust gyms. That's when I'm at my happiest for whatever reason. This was the dungiest, spit and sawdustiest, hardcoreiest, using a lot of this here, gym that I've seen. And it's amazing to see Brian's love of lifting, but also this sort of in this funny, open way. I know he did a gym tour with you guys, and he's like, whenever anyone's selling a piece of equipment, I'm just like, yeah, bring it on in. He just makes it work. And the gym has this sort of make it work feel. So I remember when we went to Ireland, and I told you about the first Hercules gym and how a lot of the equipment was made by the members themselves. It's very unique. It's very specialized. It was very temporal to Hercs itself. I had that sense of that within the gym. Now, to park my massive fandom, and Brian and Ronnie and Big J, everyone was so generous, listening to their stories was a real highlight for me. On a professional level, it is very interesting to see the interaction of the space with the bodies within it. So, French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu would often talk about habitus, and this idea of conscious and subconscious ways in which the body moves and how that responds to the environment in which it's in. We don't need to go into what that means in essence, but it's effectively, the gym as a space which interacts how its members move. And I distinctly remember Brian talking about, being hardcore and what that meant. And I was looking past him into the gym itself and seeing a young teenager going at it with drop sets and forced reps at 13 or 14 with this insane intensity. And it was just very funny, because to me it showed that there is a way in which these gyms mold the mindsets, but also the bodies of these people. So there was that fandom element there. This is incredible. And we'll talk about the history of it, the legacy, the importance, how it is unique even within an American bodybuilding space, if not a global bodybuilding space. But on a micro level, seeing how when members of the public go in, because this teenager is not he trains at Metroflex. I'm sure he knows who Ronnie is, but he's not someone who was alive when Ronnie's videos went viral, as we talked about in the last episode. There is something in that gym that changes the way people think about themselves, their bodies, either consciously or subconsciously. So that was a really cool and interesting thing for me to see, because as I said, I usually study dead people, dead gyms. Yeah. So to see it as a living, breathing space, and you got that sense of the gym as a living, breathing thing that interacted with members.
Eric, what about yourself?
Yeah, so when we first got there, Brian was working out, and he was training not only with an adult colleague of his, who we later came to find out was, I think, his pastor, and also the son of that person, so the pastor and the pastor's son. I didn't know that at the time, but I just knew they were training, and they were, Brian was giving us some looks and some time, and he shook my hand, but they were clearly there to train, and I respected the hell out of that. And when that first happens, you don't know, like, oh, are we welcome or not, or are they just training? And it became very apparent that they were just training because Brian gave us so much of his time, and you could tell. And what it came from, one thing that I really appreciated from talking to Brian is a big core piece is giving to the members or giving to the people who come there. Mm-hmm. He was saying, like, anyone can ask me for a free workout. I'll give you one of Ronnie's workouts from his '96 Olympia. That was something that stood out. So giving back to the members, a core piece to, I think, a community that is coming together for something better. And another core piece was what they actually value. I think if you were to just watch Unbelievable, or if you were to just watch Ronnie train, you think, or if you just watch Branch train, you know, okay, it's intense, and it's a place where elite people train. And I don't think that captures it all. Brian specifically said, he was recalling something, and he said, I'm going to remember this set forever. Yes. And it wasn't a set that Ronnie did. It wasn't a set that Branch did. It wasn't a set that anybody did. It was a set that maybe a teenager, young 20s lifter did, who did a set of like 30 or 40 reps on a hack squat to failure, and then got up and did it again, and then got up and did it again and laid there for 10 minutes. And Brian came over and said, man, that was awesome. So you get to learn what the core values are and what it means to be hardcore from that kind of in-depth conversation, instead of just kind of having a superficial understanding of it from watching these videos. And like when we were having our preview of our road to Ronnie, we were talking about like, oh, you get a sense of it from watching the video. I can honestly say you don't get the whole sense until you actually go there and talk to them. And I really do hope we can deliver a truer essence of those really key values when we do, release these interviews in the documentary format. And the final thing I'll say is, it was very clear that Ronnie was a part of that. He came into that. And I think it speaks to his humility, and it speaks to him contributing to a community and adopting that. He definitely had shared philosophies and values to everyone we talked to. It wasn't like, well, he's 8 times Mr. O, he's this genetic freak, so he can do whatever he wants. And it wasn't like it was dictated to him. He became like, a brother in arms there. And so I was really taken aback by some of those core values that were just on display.
I think you mentioned it in the last episode about Ronnie saying,
it's a long time ago.
About Ronnie saying, it's been such a long trip, in like the best possible way. Ronnie saying, like, I love bodybuilding. When someone's out, did we talk about that? Where he was competing?
Back in the first documentary, he in response to Kevin Lerone.
Yeah, and Kevin's like, why did you do this? You're not doing well. He's like, oh man, I love bodybuilding. And to your point about, Brian training members and effectively having this benchmark of intensity, and it doesn't matter if you're Branch or Ronnie or just, say a guy off the street who's maybe just training for health. If you have that intensity, you're brought into it. And it's to think about, he loves to train there. He loves bodybuilding. But this is something that there's so much going off camera. This is something, this is a gym that values that. Like, it's him being in the right place at the right time in a gym that really does value that, in that like intergenerational. Brian is still there, Brian is training people. So it was that sense that sometimes when you watch a bodybuilder, watch a documentary, it's like, oh, this is a atypical person within this gym, or this is someone who's raising the bar. And obviously he did to a certain extent, but actually he was like a normal, like, at least from what I saw, from what Brian said, he seemed like a normal lifter who just happened to lift more. You know what I mean? Like, they all train at that intensity.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think we were talking about how Ronnie captured everyone because he had this certain intensity, and it was these heavy loads. But I think if I had to guess, the experience of being Ronnie there was, I'm doing what we're all doing. I'm just lifting appropriate loads for my body, which are insane, But I think it speaks to the fact that he's just there doing the work. And, that's what they talked about was consistent hard work over time, basically, which is not a new message, but it is the message, honestly. And it was really cool to hear that. I also appreciated one thing. It's a divergence of what you're saying, Conor, but it's another thing that popped out in my head, or stood out in my mind, I should say, is that we were asking about, prior greats and who inspired you. And for Ronnie, it really just came down to his mother. Mm-hmm. You specifically asked him, Omar, if there were, bodybuilders from the prior generation who inspired him. And he said that his main inspiration was his mother. And I think I just think it's really interesting. And it speaks to why he has such a deep and also relatively unique connection to the iron, and why he's just going to keep going no matter what. Because I think there's much more meaning attached to why he lifts than someone who just went, I want to be like the guy from the last generation in the sport, and kind of keeps the concept of bodybuilding restricted and constrained to the sport itself.
Yeah, we had, so a few things. We had agreed upon set of questions. Okay, we got Ronnie, we got some time. What would we ask? And one of the first ones was, what bodybuilders inspired you? And then he gave the story, which we knew some of it, that he actually was a powerlifter like in high school, and he loved lifting heavy. Liked the idea of the hardcore gym of Brian Dobson. And then Brian had to convince him. So when we asked the question, were there any bodybuilders that you looked up to? He said truthfully, no. Then I remembered later on, and so I asked the question, because he was talking a bunch of different things about passion for bodybuilding, his faith, family. Then he brought up something that his mother said. And I remember in one of the segments of one of the documentaries where he was talking about his mom, and he said, I actually get my genetics from my mom. And then he also mentioned the hard work. It's like, well, that actually is really cool, where your main inspiration, where you draw therefore strength from, is from someone outside of, in quotations, fitness, that gives you that power in order to apply it within this context, which is the gym. And I find it interesting just to share my own personal thoughts about Metroflex. I think this anecdote will best represent Metroflex to me, in the sense that, and I've seen this before, but I think it is representative within Metroflex very well. It is hardcore on the outside. It has its core set of principles. Adherence to those principles is expected because it's a small gym, so you influence the culture of it by participating in it. So they have a framework. You agree, you enter. But once you're there, they will not only accept you, but they'll be very generous. So they have a pre-planned a sense of culture. And the generosity, actually, once you're inside of that, I could kind of just gauge, would be quite high, uncommonly high, higher than you would assume just by taking a look and this is a very hardcore gym. The machines, the lifting, the grunting, are they going to be friendly? And that's kind of the wrong way of thinking about it. And the anecdote is the following. So a contemporary gym that I went to recently to actually collaborate with one of our athletes, Zoo Culture. I have no problem saying that. It's not like a knock against them, but their day pass, I believe, was like $75. Not an exaggeration, okay? Now, that price point is like almost purposely exclusionary, or almost treating it like it's a vacation destination, probably because they realize there's a lot of people that want to go there. This could be a profit-making venture, right? So they could charge that amount and get it. Okay, so $75, which is uncommonly high. Fair play to them. But it shows in terms of, it's assumed people want to visit there, and so there's an extraction there for you to visit. Okay. Metroflex, both times. Now, keep in mind, the first time, which I'll touch back on in a second, thanks to Big J, didn't have to pay. Brian Dobson, to be clear, the owner, I think he was aware of what we were doing, like superficially. Big J has spoken to him, but not really. And so when I first interacted with him, he didn't documentary crew, they're filming something, da-da-da. Yes, you get a free pass. I more or less was just honestly kind of like a semi-stranger. It had been a decade. He didn't know who I was. He was training, so he also was a little, caught up in training. What my ask was, but I said, what do I owe you? There's 6 of us. What do I owe you? He said, don't worry about it, man. And that's what he said before he understood. And I want to emphasize that. So this wasn't a transaction, okay? And I noticed that too, and a story, I think you guys were outside, there was a kid that was a member, and the kid, I think he had something he had some chalk, he wanted it or this, that. And there's a story I was only half listening, but Brian said, here, just take this pouch and you can keep it or whatever. And he gave it to the end. The guy said, really? And it's like, yeah. And so just like right in front, and he's not doing that because I'm right in front of him. But I actually insisted afterwards, because when you're treated with respect like that, you automatically want to reciprocate it, and it creates a culture. And that's part of the culture of hard work that you see, because it's an agreed upon set of rules, as I said before. And so Ronnie entered that, and it gave a pathway for him to express himself, and then individuals like Branch Warren. But I would say Metroflex, from my experience at least, and as long as, once again, I said, like, you get the vibe, you understand where you're going, the generosity actually is uncommonly high. And that is perhaps a thing that would surprise a lot of people. Like, after I said, hey, Brian, like, please, like, thank you. He wasn't like, oh, no, for sure. He's like, yeah, you want, it's like, yeah, like, rather cool. Like, yeah, appreciate it. Like, I almost had to like force the issue upon him. And you could make the argument, Conor, you could say, well, okay, like, guess what? Like, zoo culture is popping out. It's very popular. There's a market demand for it.
To be clear, just because you didn't actually say it, you were insistent about paying for all of our day, like paying all that we paid for all our day passes.
Yeah. But I had to insist upon it.
Except me. I said, do you know who I am? He said no, and I said no one really does.
The Conor Heffernan.
I'm so sorry. I don't know why.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I came all the way from Ireland for this. Like, come on. Like, that's
come on, dude. Okay.
And so it's interesting to me because, again, someone that's like cynical is like, oh, like, guys, you're making a big deal about this, like, whatever. Like, zoo culture is an example. Let's make a quick counter argument. And I think there's something here to what we're talking about: gym culture, hardcore gyms, maybe a misunderstanding from outsiders, the idea that a lot of the people that belong to these gyms are viewed actually in the inverse way as outsiders, right? They're not normal. And so you find your tribe, so to speak. But getting back to zoo culture real quick, you make the argument, oh, it's very popular right now. They deserve it, right? People want to go there, therefore they could charge it. Oh, a Metroflex. At the time, Ronnie Coleman was like popular, but now maybe it's not as popular. Therefore, it's just good business practice to give free gym passes. Well, A, it's incredibly uncommon. 2, its reputation does precede itself. When I went in 2013, Branch Warren was still training there, as an example. So it's not like it wasn't popular. And YouTube at the time, once again, no one understood it. So Big J basically just said, he vouched for me. That's actually what happened. This is my buddy, didn't have to pay for anything. Brian Dobson, and that's why it was a respect thing. So it's not an issue of popularity or how much one can charge, and that's how they view things, Conor.
So there's actually even though they are very different places and very different decades, there's a really interesting parallel with the original Gold's Gym, run by Joe Gold, and it was a place initially for like his bodybuilding buddies, and then members of the general public would come, and then eventually people would flock from all over the US to train at Gold's. And in one sense, it was perceived as like a very exclusionary place. This is where all the bodybuilders trained. Well, actually, they trained all over the place, but at least from pumping iron, this is where all the bodybuilders trained. And if you read stories of people who would have ended up being like national or even just regional bodybuilding champions, they would go to Goals, they'd be like, on a bench. Someone, let's just say for argument's sake, Franco would come over and say, can you bench those, 100-pound dumbbells? Like, yeah. Okay, come on over, train with us. Like, there was a sense of like, once you passed the litmus test, so to speak, you are part of that tribe. And that's why even in pumping iron, there's that iconic scene of Arnold showing these two guys how to pose. And if you read their backstory, they effectively got in a car, drove to the Goals. They vibed with the atmosphere there, for want of a better phrase, and suddenly they're part of that culture. And when you look at Brian and you listen to his stories, it's like, okay, so our litmus test is hard work and respect. And once those two things are passed, you're in. But the contrast of that, Omar, is a very astute comment. Like, these people are oftentimes seen as potentially exclusionary, like they're hardcore. Like, if you look at a Branch Warren training video, you'd be terrified. Like, quite frankly, I have such respect for him and how he trained, but it's scary. Like, it is scary. But that gym is a place where there is that sense of, no, like, you're here to train, you're training. Like, we respect that. And if you look in Brian's office, I can't help, I always have the historian's eye. There's newspapers everywhere in that office of his various people who train there, the champions, the people who were notable. Like 80 to 90% of them will have like a little throwaway line. Like, the gym membership is whatever was the time, like, so like $30 a month. But Brian makes an exception, or Brian made an exception for X, Y, and Z, or for people who are struggling, or for people who he wants to get trained. Like Ronnie obviously gave a free gym membership to, which actually I thought was exceptional. Like, I thought this is like, you saw Ronnie's like, oh my God, I know what this guy can do. But that's actually, it seemed to be the norm. If you look around his office, all of these newspaper articles effectively saying it's this, but if you're serious, if you're here to train, we'll make that accommodation. And that's where you get that unique ecosystem versus a commercial gym, which might use dynamic price. It might be like,
they've got a litmus test too. Do you have $75?
Or
What's
Do
your
you
follower
have
count?
$85? Like,
Yeah.
you know,
You really want to get in. How much money you got in your pockets, man?
yeah, not very much, but that's academia. So there is that very fascinating way of bringing people together. And I think when you have a gym owner who has the prestige of Brian, who was very notable in his own career, and then, you know, like the story is often that he launched Ronnie, which I think does a disservice to who Brian is and what he has done. But when you have someone like that being like, yeah, come on in, like it's very counterintuitive to how those gyms are typically seen. And like, let's not beat around the bush. That is not every hardcore gym. That is not every dungeon gym. That is not every spit and sawdust gym. But some of them do have that communal element. And I think, you know, from, again, my own upbringing in Hercules in Dublin, that communal element to those other types of gyms that aren't commercial gyms, when that works, it is actually magic. Like, it is lightning in a bottle.
Yeah. Well, it's like, in X-Men, the Morlocks, the freaks look after the other freaks, right? Where like it's a safe refuge because in a way, again, it's these weird inversions of what you'd assume where you think you'd be judged there. But again, you pass the litmus test and you're allowed to be who you are or express what you want to be in other places you wouldn't or wouldn't be allowed. So if you go to your typical gym, it'd be frowned upon to lift heavy, to essentially exercise both yourself and your demons, like quite frankly, the things that you're going through. So it is a place established for the other. And I think what's interesting is once that's understood, there are many things that, such as the generosity in this specific instance, that then start to make a lot more sense. And like any good community, that's where we were talking about, Eric, before, like, you know, powerlifting or like any growth of a sport or a space is contingent upon members of the community having an encouraging space to their prospective members that they want. So again, a hardcore gym looks a little bit different, right? In terms of who they want. But I just find it interesting to your point, Conor, about Ronnie. Like, I would almost put forth that Brian set the tone. And we'll speak maybe a little bit about him training with Tom Platz, and we'll definitely get back to Ronnie because, you know, this is the Ronnie Coleman recap. But what's just so interesting, I think, understanding through Brian, who gave us over an hour and a half interview, gave us a tour of Metroflex, you see a lot of Ronnie in that story as he interacted with the space and the space interacted with him. But I don't think it was serendipitous, all that to say what we've been discussing, that Ronnie eventually came to Metroflex. Its reputation preceded, you know, anything. So he heard it. He said, oh, wait a second. Like, this is a notable gym. Like, I should go here. Brian established that culture, fostered then the community, and then its subsequent generations were at that point, you have Ronnie, and then you have like a branch, the next generation coming. So you really see how there's that chain, right? A continuous sequence of events that leads to these things. And cycling back a little bit further, and we could, once again, 100% jump to Ronnie. This is a fun fact that I didn't know before this. I don't know if this is public knowledge, but Brian Dobson first got into lifting at an uncommonly young age, which is super cool, right? So he got into it when he was a teenager. He bought the magazines. He bought like the different sets and so forth. And he saw Dave Draper. Not Dave Draper, sorry. He saw Tom Platz. Tom Platz.
The other blonde
bomber.
Yeah.
He saw Tom Platz. And when he was 18, he actually got a program from him. He actually witnessed him train. He said 425 for 28 reps. I remember those two because that's exactly what he said.
Squats.
Number of squats of doing it and how he laid back. But true intensity, anyways, this passageway, Eric, that exists within a subculture. Well, think about it. Tom, I believe, is 3 years older, but he's still, when you're 18 versus 21, that's a huge gap.
Yep.
And he tested, how did he test Brian out? By making him curl. He passed the curl test. So there's a litmus test, much like any hero's journey. Like in mythology, you're wearing a...
Can you curl 135?
Yeah. Like, can you pull this? Like, what is this test? You make the test. John Berardi, very similar, because bodybuilders, I think they're acutely aware of their time, where they know they don't want it to be wasted. And there's a quick, like, kind of heuristic they'll use. So for John Berardi, that bodybuilder, show up at 6 a.m. Right? Or 5 a.m. It may have even been 5 a.m., but that's his test.
Are you willing to get up first thing in the morning and train?
Yeah, Tom Platz, let me see you curl this. Curl that, oh, okay, you could lift with me. But this continuous sequence of events that led to this and how things are interconnected.
Yeah, and you called it, you know? You were, so like the through thread, it really makes sense in retrospect. Like, oh man, Tom Platz, okay, Dorian, okay, Ronnie, like you can see this through thread of the key element of intensity and effort. And, you know, one thing we were talking about, how they're not exclusionary there. but they actually do know exactly what is not their philosophy.
Yeah.
And that's anyone who's training like a you-know-what,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that was made very clear. And it's not like, now you have to leave the gym, but you will know. Like, so it became very clear from multiple stories that this is an environment where you make each other better. Yeah. So if we see you and you're holding back and maybe you think that was to failure, or maybe you think you couldn't have done another rep, or you think you couldn't have done another set, one of the members will tell you, and they're obligated to, they're expected to. That's normal, and it is considered we're all lifting each other up. So it was really interesting to hear that Brian inherited the training philosophy of Tom Platz in, I think, 75. Is that the year he said?
Yep, right around there.
Yeah, and then we come to find out that he opened 11 years later. Yeah. He ends up buying the gym from someone who really didn't want it
for $2,000.
Yeah, for $2,000, and then turns it into Metroflex, and he cultivates and carries on that legacy and creates a community of intensity. And I don't want to scoop, Brian's probably one of his most interesting lines that was unexpected, but I think he would probably say that no matter how Ronnie trained, so long as he trained with the intensity he had and all that he would have become a Mr. Olympia. And that really that speaks to his respect for Ronnie's capabilities. But I think it's also worth saying that I'm not sure necessarily that Ronnie would be all the things that we see Ronnie as if he hadn't been in that environment. I mean, he might have been just as big, just as shredded, and just as successful. I don't know if it would have been for as long or that same pathway. But I do wonder, and we can't know, but I would guess that some aspects of the things that I love about Ronnie that I brought up before, about how it is just in his being that he loves bodybuilding. And remind you, he didn't start competing in bodybuilding until he met Brian, that I think came from that environment.
So when the Victorians were building prisons, and this will make sense in like 2 seconds, okay? They used an architectural idea called the panopticon. So this was, you would have a guard tower in the middle of a circle, and then the idea is that every cell can be monitored at any moment. Yeah. So Michel Foucault talked about this idea of governmentality, this idea that society is built around the idea of us governing ourselves. In Metroflex, we see this sort of panopticon idea, where we are ingrained under the watchful eye of Brian or under the watchful eye of the other members to push ourselves past failure. So it is that sort of embodied sense then of, I need to push to these levels. And as you said, they have a very distinct line of what is acceptable, what is unacceptable. There is an interest taken in those who are acceptable. There's, they just let the other ones be. Like you do you, 3 sets of 8, that's fine. See you on Tuesday. And the other people, I'll always remember that set on the hack squat where someone's going up and down, up and down. So there's that really interesting self-governance among everyone. And like, he probably is right that Ronnie's strength, because he was a powerlifter, he probably would have trained strong regardless, wherever he went. But that, in that sense then of this self-governing regulation, like, this is what is acceptable here. And the link between Brian and Tom Platz is fascinating, but also the link between Brian and powerlifting in the 70s, which was more like outlaw country. Like, it was more reckless. It was more, not reckless, that's too strong a word, but it was more like,
rebellious?
Rebellious, yeah, there was more rebellious, like, we're not holding back. And those two sort of crossroads intersecting with Brian, who then obviously went into bodybuilding, it's a fascinating thing as a historian to see these through threads that I didn't know existed, like quite literally training under Tom Platz, having that powerlifting background, when it is that more like, outlaw country, for want of a better phrase, aesthetic to powerlifting, and bringing them together and putting it into a gym. And we talked about the through thread from like Lee Haney to Ronnie. And I think this is a really good reminder that we shouldn't think of bodybuilding just by, champion to champion to champion, because that's not actually nuanced enough. We need to think about the groups, the communities, and the intimate connections, in the sense of, we have Tom, training with Brian training with all these powerlifters, Brian opening his own gym, Ronnie then coming into that gym. Like, it's a much more complex idea of how these gyms emerge, but it's more true to life.
It's also a product of Texas, so there's a really interesting intersection there where Texas, and especially in that time, and still is, it's heavily dominated by powerlifting. Like, there's no other state that I'm aware of, and there probably are, but I know that if you were to say which state is strongest for powerlifting, you'd say Texas, because they have like a high school federation, that, like in the USAPL, you compete in high school, like a high school powerlifting team. And there wasn't at that time, according to Brian, a whole lot going on for bodybuilding, but there always has been a very strong Texas powerlifting culture. And it's kind of cool how you can see almost the roots of what the contemporary person who pays attention to our lifting community would conceive of as the hardcore powerlifting culture, which would be West Side. It's got roots that go back 30 years prior, even to that, which I think is really interesting. And there are hardcore bodybuilding communities and there's hardcore powerlifting communities. There's even hardcore communities. And I'll say like hardcore has almost become, since like the 80s and 90s, like it's like a code word for, and also we use illicit steroids, especially in the States. And there's hardcore magazines for bodybuilding. But I can tell you in the natural bodybuilding community, especially like in the UK, there's a lot of natural bodybuilders who are heavily inspired by kind of the Dorian Yates lineage and other athletes who are more contemporary who train like that. And they train as heavy as they can, and they go to failure, and they don't do as much volume, and they train in dungeon gyms. And there's also this whole other element of, when we get shredded. Because like conditioning was something that Dorian really brought to the table, those grainy black and white pictures. I think I mentioned that last time. And the UK, for people who don't know, and this might seem like a tangent, but I will bring it back around, they are probably the most consistently shredded competitors in the natural bodybuilding circuit, and they are always diced. And it's kind of like this, we do the hard work portion. And that's not something that is expressed in powerlifting culture, but it is the core tenet of we do the hard things, you know? And that gets expressed in so many different ways, and they're so similar, but they come about organically, even when they're disconnected and on different continents, which I think is just really interesting. And they take different shapes just because of the randomness of changes in regional areas. Like, okay, so powerlifting strong in Texas and bodybuilding isn't. So now you have this Metroflex that comes about in the 80s, 20 years after powerlifting even starts, and it's heavily influenced by powerlifting because that's what's there, but it's still a bodybuilding gym.
And you have someone like Brian who, behind him, we have the wall full of bodybuilders. There's several photos of Tom Platz who had that like very clear impact on the sort of young Brian. But then we have the great the great powerlifter, Doug Young, was on the board as well.
100%.
And so he is attempting with Metroflex and succeeding, like don't get me wrong, molding a certain idea of bodybuilding inspired by Tom Platz with that like 70s, 80s powerlifting, which is like big, bulky, like it's a very interesting time when you get even someone like, Lee Marin squatting 1,000 pounds for the first time, like, and you read stories about this, like these are people like going after it in a way that I think is less scientific. Not I don't mean that they weren't clever about their training, but I just mean there was a sense of like pushing boundaries, like, the car is driving and like the doors are all falling off. Like Lee Marin nearly got knocked out before he squatted 1,000 pounds. So there is this sense of like these two worlds colliding in. And then that sets the scene for Metroflex, which then sets the scene for when Ronnie comes in, who has the powerlifting background anyway. And now he's being brought into a gym that has a very specific idea of bodybuilding in the sense of how impactful Tom Platz was for Brian. And I know this is the Ronnie episode, but I just think you cannot understand, like obviously the historian has said this, you cannot understand the person without understanding the place that they inhabit, and also you're right, Eric, the state that they inhabit. Like there's not a New York deadlift bar unless I'm those coastal elites. Am I right? I'm kidding. I'm so kidding. But like it is, you're right. Texas is synonymous with powerlifting, and then so it's like the place of the gym, but then the place of the state as well. And Ronnie moving through these worlds.
Conor, I do want you to get into a working definition right before we talk about Big Ronnie, and that is of what a hardcore gym is, or what is the encapsulation of this general concept, because I'm going to give you guys a hot take. Metroflex is absolutely a hardcore gym, and it has the fixings such as the state of the gym, the equipment, the mindset, so on and so forth. But on the spectrum of a hardcore gym, I'd say it is hardcore, but there are a lot more gyms, and I could think of a few, and one I'm comfortable mentioning is Westside, where everything that we've described is turned up to 11. A few examples that have been shared publicly, and I have heard something. So Sean, shout out to Sean, Fortis Fitness, where he incorporates a little bit of that element, but it still is a general strength gym. But you see, once again, shades. But anyways, where someone, tears their pec when they're doing 315, and the other people are laughing at that person instead of helping them. That's an extreme hardcore example. Someone else, I'll say, that they had their rack And if anyone is using the rack, he would throw his belt in that rack, and they have 5 minutes to get out. Otherwise, they're going to fight. These are there are so many stories like this. We have not heard similar stories. I've heard some things from Metroflex, but on that scale, what I'm saying of a hardcore gym, to me, it's kind of interesting where Metroflex definitely is a tough gym. It's an identity. It's an identity that Brian vibes with. And I think he routinely brought up, you want to speak about Doug Young. I want to be like him. I want to be badass. Some of those, like, let's say typically assume like masculine traits, he would attribute and say like, oh, I want those things. I not only want to be big, I want to be strong. Also the implication, I want to be intimidating. When that dude walked into the gym, remember the guy that he competed in the bodybuilding show where he said out loud, like, he was not a nice dude. He said, but I want to be like that guy where he's a tough. So he had those elements of powerlifting. And some other gyms, like once in talk like Ohio and a few others that I've heard about, they turn that up to 11. It seems like those aspects are part of what is necessary. But I would say this is a hot take, it is hardcore, but it's not unnecessarily so, where almost some people revel in that sense. It's more, from what I understood with the way that Brian described it, it's the work ethic that they celebrated. So it's not like how much pain can one endure. And so I'm just wondering, Conor, if you could commentate on that, because we've all been using the exact same phrase. It's counterculture, it's counter to commercial gyms, a hardcore gym. Can you just talk about that a little bit? And then we're getting into big wrong.
It's a very good point, because I realize we're delving into the same thing that people do with intensity. And my favorite story about intensity is supposedly, maybe apocryphal, but I think we'll see, the historical record is interesting. Arnold Schwarzenegger going to train with Arthur Jones and only lasting like a day, maybe a day and a half, and then saying, no, this is too much for me, I'm going home. But then people training with Arnold and saying, no, this is way too intense, like I can't handle it. And Randy Roach says, intensity is in the eye of the beholder. I think, though, the way that hardcore gyms are traditionally defined and understood in a bodybuilding sphere, at least, and certainly in powerlifting, A, it is countercultural, B, it tends to be seen as an intimidating and potentially like exclusionary place. And C, I think it is usually defined as a pursuit of excellence to the point of recklessness, if we're being honest. Now, and the problem with this is it can spill over. So something that's interesting to me is listening to, say, Dave Tate's roundtables, where he'll have people in, and Jim Wendler and a few others were on one recently, and like they're telling those stories and laughing about them, but now looking back on it, they are at times at least being candid, saying like, man, that really was like, I don't think we needed to do that necessarily to get to where we want to. But something that interested me about Metroflex, and I'll move on to that in a second before we think of hardcore, it is culturally specific, to different gyms. It means different things to different people. But I think those three things of, countercultural, without a doubt, every hardcore gym is countercultural. It is not your typical commercial gym. It's not your typical box gym, etc. It tends to be seen as exclusionary. There's a big asterisk on that, and I'll return to that. But it is always, I think, attached to like a ruthless pursuit of excellence, be it in bodybuilding, powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, CrossFit, whatever the case may be. Now, the reason why I'm putting exclusionary with an asterisk is oftentimes it's seen as exclusionary to people who are outside of the space and are projecting onto that space. And I say that because on the door of Metroflex, it says hardcore co-ed gym. Mm-hmm. And that was very interesting to me, because we were going in, I was like, oh, that's not typically something that I see on a gym. I was like, okay, that's interesting. Like, put it at the back of my mind. I was like, okay. But then Brian was saying, when he started training, one of the gyms that he had was like, or he attended was like Monday, Wednesday, Friday was men only. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday was women only. So when he opened Metroflex, he was like, well, I mean, like, you train, like, we're here to work. Like, so it doesn't matter who it is. It's men, women, whatever. Now, we don't know. Like, I'm not saying that, he opened the co-ed gym and there was like, 50 women and then 50 guys training at the same time. But just that idea of, if you do the work, you're allowed in here. And like, again, it wasn't a rosy place, where he says, like, he talks about a certain group of people, and he's like, that guy was a mean guy. Like, he was not someone that you would like to see on the street. And, sometimes that spilled into the gym or whatever. But there was also that, like, if you are part of our tribe, you can come in. And likewise with Westside, something that Louis did very well, and one of the reasons why there's such devotion to Louis is there are people who were maybe outcasts, or people, who typically American society would exclude. Like, a lot of ex-convicts would have quite a big devotion to Louis because they'd go train at Westside and say, turn the life around, etc. But like, if you share their values, they are very open in that space. So I think, hardcore can at times be like watered down. Yeah, I'm thinking of the Jack Black song, the legend of the rent was hardcore, if you're going to live hardcore, etc. But I think it does have those three tenets, but there is that asterisk on exclusionary, and like they play it up as well, because there is that marketing element. I'm not saying that just about Metroflex, but West Side, but like a lot of hardcore gyms would play it up. Even like Dorian Yates' gyms in Birmingham, like you can just go and get a day pass, you can train. Like I could go in, I could just do abs and then go home. Like it's fine. But there's often that perception because it sells in a fitness space as well. And I'm not saying about them, but just magazine articles that have been written around. If I'm doing a documentary, I'm going to pitch it in a certain way. So I think the main thing to take from that hardcore element is it's often seen as exclusionary, but for someone like Brian, that was a big deal for the type of gym he was creating to have slapped in front. This is who we are, and likewise with all of the Christian writings and messages around it. When you go in, there's the 10 Commandments, on the front of his space. Like he's very open about who this is for, what it's about. But the main entry point is actually the work and the desire to be part of that, regardless of the field. You can be a Mr. Olympia, or you can be that guy. And Brian was very, kind of like that guy used to be very heavy set, lost a load of weight. He seems to just be, pursuing his life, trying to achieve the best physique that he can. Awesome. I'm going to remember that for the rest of my life. So it is funny, the currency, this is the word that I've been fumbling for, in these gyms opens a huge amount of doors.
Eric, I want to kick it over to you, but to that point, talking about the currency of work grants equality, essentially, or opportunity, let's say. He brought up in another way, and you'll hear like in the documentary where Brian, because of the era and everything he talks about, he's like this, oh, that's badass, man, or like these chicks, or like, oh, what have you. But then he puts forward, interesting enough, the hardest worker at Metroflex was this woman who was squatting 315. She was the most badass out of all of us, he said, the most hardcore. And to your point, that's
he said she was the most badass athlete out of all of us.
Most badass athlete out of all. Like
she could do flips across the parking lot. I remember
think about Ronnie, Branch Warren, right? So he's paying respect because that currency of work earns you the right. And I think to your point, like, let's put it another way, Conor, before we kick it over to Eric. If someone like want to be like Bay City banker, that they could go to like some global gym and they could buy the right to lord over others in having a personal trainer, having the elite, like they buy the gold membership, which grants them the jacuzzi and like what have you. They're buying their right. You cannot buy your right in this gym. And so it'd be exclusionary to them. And that's why it's an outsider's perspective in terms of what that means. But really, because it's a small environment where you can influence the culture, I think it's necessarily protective almost. And so you're setting up, it's like a dog, they'll start to growl at you. It's letting you know, like, these are the standards. This is what that means. So let's jump forward, Eric. I couldn't help but think about that, though, man. I bet like West Side and other gyms, we're talking about hardcore. I'm like, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I've been Metro. I've seen it, like all these things, but yeah, there are some other where they almost revel in it in a wild way. So let's talk about now Big Ronnie. So our meeting with him, just like we won't give like a play-by-play because it was like we interviewed him for 15 minutes. We could actually probably accurately recount that in 15 minutes. But just you, like in terms of your story where you're speaking about that in the previous episode, like how you got into lifting, Ronnie, and then us meeting him, and just that overall experience into a little bit more detail.
For me, so Ronnie pulled up and he's got 8 times Mr. O as his license plate. Mm-hmm. I mean, I respect that.
Nice whip too.
Nice whip. Yep. Just coming off, doing some work that required us to change the time a little bit. And, and he's not the same Ronnie, but in all the important ways he is. Mm-hmm. If you've seen the recent documentaries, it's very common if you follow him on social media, that he can't move the way he used to, that there was a botched surgery, there was an injury, and I found it entirely inspirational and utterly unsurprising when you understand what's at the core of Ronnie, that he does what he has to do to get in the gym, and then he gets after it. And one of the things that was really cool to me, we were doing we interviewed Brian Dobson, and he had to go run some errands, and then we interviewed Big J, and then we got to interview Ronnie, and then we finished with Brian Dobson, and we were kind of trying to coordinate all these different things because it was quite the environment. so Ronnie's training while we're interviewing Brian Dobson the first time, and there was a couple points where like, hey, can you just check on where they're at? Omar was doing a fantastic job interviewing Ronnie, and I was trying to run interference, make sure no one walks in because the door opens, the music's so loud because Ronnie's training, and our audio is going to get cut out. But so I go out just to see how's the training going, because we've got just big shout out to the people running the cameras. So, I mean, it was hot. It was hot. I actually got to the point where I thought I might have fainted. I'm contest prepping. It took a little bit longer. I didn't bring enough water. That's my bad.
It was 105 degrees. It wasn't very hot.
No, coming from Ireland, I was like, come on, Eric. Come on.
I mean, I wasn't training. I was just walking around, and I was like, why is my Fitbit is telling me that I'm earning zone minutes, and I'm like, I really shouldn't be in like a zone 2 workout right now, standing.
You interrupting the interview to tell Brian that my Fitbit is telling me that my heart's beating a little bit too fast. Is there a cool area that I can, cool down in?
It's not exactly what happened.
Indirectly, Eric got banned. You didn't know this? Like, he just has
a Fitbit. Yeah.
Meanwhile, Conor was spitting on the ground. And he's like, hell yeah. Like, that's my guy right there. No, but I remember looking over to you, speaking about the sacrifice, like, not like, again, in the context of Metroflex, shout out to the videographers, Brandon and Joseph.
So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. So I went out there to check on them, and Joseph has this huge smile on his face. Joseph is 17. There's no reason he should know who Ronnie is, but he absolutely does. Much respect. And he was like, dude, this is so surreal. And I'm like, are you getting good footage? And like, dude, he's getting after it. So like, I'm actually really looking forward, because we were in there. We didn't get to see Ronnie train, but to see the look on Joseph's face of watching Ronnie push just as hard, music blaring, doing what he can, and pushing himself to his current capabilities, which seems to be the through thread of what hardcore is. And I'll tell you what, like, I can't live with the idea that personally as a bodybuilder that I haven't done what I can within the constraints of where I've decided my life is going to be to push myself as far as I can. So like, if I have a workout set up and I know I can do it, again, there's a lot of moderation going on. It's appropriate that I'm wearing the shirt of Icarus. Like because I've done it recklessly. I've done the reckless hardcoreness of pushing myself past my limit and actually it getting in the way of getting to my goals. But at my core, I relate to hardcore, because if I can look in the mirror and go, I could have done this, or I could have done that, or I wasn't sacrificing anything. Like, it wasn't like, I could have worked harder and it wouldn't have impacted my marriage, or it wouldn't have impacted my job. I just didn't work harder. I can't live like that. It's not in me. So I see that in Ronnie, and I love it. And to hear and see on Joseph's face that was still there, I was excited. And that was that moment that wasn't actually even part of the interview, kind of got at the center of why I was excited to meet him and why I have so much respect for the man.
Well, Eric, I got to give a huge shout out to the young blood, to Joseph, because he is well wise beyond his years, and he's incredibly perceptive. And while he's only 17, his father was showing. His father is, I believe, in his 40s. He's been lifting since he was a teenager. Joseph was aware. Joseph has been watching YouTube content for almost a decade. So that means since he was like 7 or 8, because his father had it on in the background. Pumping iron, he was aware of it.
That's awesome, and also a little scary, I'm not gonna lie.
He is way too emotionally mature. Like, if you're like, he's a very emotionally mature and astute man, and you're like, he watched YouTube. I'm so surprised that, okay.
No, he is incredibly perceptive. I picked up on that. And so he gets what it is, and he gets the environment, and he knows how to read a room. And also, I've taken him to a few different places, and I'll just put it this way. He didn't react in those places like he reacted at Metroflex, that other kids his age would react more in those places. He also didn't treat Metroflex like a curiosity where it's a relic of the past. Oh, it's like visiting a carnival almost, right? To see either the freaks, or you're going to a museum to visit something that happened in a time past. Here, in a very real sense, you have the past meaning the present, which is now, to the future, which is someone like a Joseph who knows what a story is, how it will be written, in observing Ronnie. And you see that linkage, and I keep bringing up that concept of passing it down the through thread. And then we talk about the whole idea of what currency is being paid and what are we really getting after, or that the pursuit of excellence, even at the expense of self. And I think like in a way, like Ronnie's life in terms of what he pursued and what he attested to fits perfectly with that.
Well, I was just going to say on that, I think, I think a lot of people, and if they haven't, they should. The King, the documentary about Ronnie, and because I was reflecting on this for an article that I'm writing, and on the one hand, it's a very tragic story of someone who was at the absolute peak, of their field and at the peak of their physicality, and is now struggling with quite simple bodily movements. So like there's one way of looking at that documentary with a lot of poignancy and sadness, and I think the way that it was made was trying to feed into that poignancy quite a lot. But there is also that other element of it, of someone who is facing huge adversities at any point, could throw in the towel, etc., but is continuing on. And this is not to elevate him above anyone else, but it is to stress his love of what he is doing. And I think the interesting thing, talking to Joseph, but also just looking at Ronnie when he was training and seeing, teenagers, like high schoolers, looking at him and then getting after it themselves. There is that sense, and it's something that isn't talked about enough in the bodybuilding space, and it's something that actually Arnold is doing very well at the moment, is this idea of exercise across the life cycle and adapting across the way. So Arnold recently did a workout with someone, and they were saying, he just does machines now because that's sort of where he's at in the space. But when he's training on the machines, he is training to the best of his capability. He's doing what he has with what he can, and not in a performative way, but in a, like, this is what I love to do. Maybe some accommodations have to be made, but this is what I'm now doing. And it's very interesting for me because the idea of life cycle in fitness is not discussed because it tends to be heavily weighted towards late teens, early 20s, to a certain extent. Even if the top bodybuilders are maybe in their 30s, early 40s before they retire, we tend to focus on a younger demographic. They have more disposable income, etc. But it is very interesting to see that. And I would actually love to see a series which goes to, every top 5 Olympia or Mr. Olympia finisher and see how they have adapted after their careers, who's kept with it, why have they kept with it, and how have they accommodated to that. Because when you were talking to Ronnie, the love of what he was doing came across, but just seeing how he trained, and it is a sense of, like, this is what I do, I'm going to push myself, and this is something that I'm not going to let go of. This is a core part of who I am, and that is in the King documentary, but I think they overemphasize at times the poignancy of it. And it's a brilliant documentary because there's two ways of looking at it. And I think there's a genius in that. But it is fascinating to see that exercise across the life cycle, especially in a hardcore setting, which tends to be never really talked about.
100%.
Yeah, I do. I get the genuine sense that there are no regrets there. That it's not an option to not train. Like, I brush my teeth, I train. This is who I am. So do I have regrets of training? And you get the classic line from Ronnie that is, the only regret I have is that I didn't do another rep with 800 pounds, right? And as maybe that might sound cliche because we've heard it a bunch of times and it's like doubling down on something, but I think it actually speaks to focusing on the time and the moment and the process and the journey. Like, I was pushing myself as hard as I could. I look back, I wonder if I could have got another. I think he actually says I think I could have got 5, which I love it, right? Yeah. I'm that optimistic, never-ending self-belief that I could push myself further, which is why you do, which is why you find failure, because you're trying to push to it. And I think that is timeless to some degree. And I think we've talked about it, from Platts to Dorian to Ronnie and to that being encapsulated in Metroflex. But I think it's also something that is encapsulated by almost anyone drawn to bodybuilding. We had that episode not that long ago about the resurgence of HIIT, and how for some odd reason, Mike Mentzer is being promoted by some of these massive TikTok influencers right now with the younger generation. Conor was telling us how his website traffic spikes now. He's like, what's going on? Why is everyone reading about Mike Mentzer? And it's because there is something, and we've talked about some of the issues with having this very dogmatic philosophy, and it's important. I know we're probably sounding super sociological on this episode, which is
Michel Foucault.
Yeah, I mean we're getting a little, even for iron culturists, they're like, what's going on here?
I'm the equivalent of a coastal. I'm an Irish elite. I'm not really sure what I'm going for.
You got a lot of coasts.
You're
surrounded by coasts.
All coast.
All elitism. But I think that is attractive because it is almost it's gluttonous version of, oh, everything is intensity, like everything is pushing yourself, and that's the only philosophy, and nothing else does anything, and this is everything, and I don't need it to be rational, even though I can cloak it in that. I have told people about the bodybuilding.com poster, who's like this hit evangelist, who has this quote in their signature that I'd look at as a rational, analytical person. I'm like, how do you not see this makes no sense? It only takes one bullet to kill a man. Why would it take more than one bullet why would it take more than one set to train a muscle? And I'm like, that literally makes no sense, you know? But to the person who is just at their core being, they make that their identity. That's not the point. You know, the point is that is one of the through threads that I think all bodybuilders understand to some degree.
And one of the more fascinating things, we're talking to Ronnie, and he was talking about, going for that 9th, because at the moment, and it really doesn't look like it'll happen for a long time. It's Ronnie and Lee Haney joined first, 8 Olympias. Really, I know when Jay beat him, Ronnie came in like worse than he had in previous years, but there was a sense going into that. Yeah, Ronnie will probably hit that 9. But talking to you guys, where it's like, the 9 would have been nice, but 8 isn't too bad. And it is that idea of that external and internal cues. We're talking about, was it Kevin Laverne was saying to him, like, if I wasn't winning, like, I wouldn't be doing this. And this isn't to denigrate Kevin Laverne, because, like, look at his career. But it's very interesting with Ronnie, like, now at the stage where he's at, he was very candid, like, I'm so proud of what I've done, but, like, yeah, that's it. Like, I'm going to train.
Yeah, I think it's this misperception that we sometimes attribute to athletes, where we think that they just, no matter what, pedal to the metal, and they go until they just, and instead of cracking into the wall that everyone else does, they break through it. And it's just not true. I just know too many high-level athletes. You have read and seen athletes throughout their lifespan, those both alive and not. As a historian, Omar, you've been in the fitness space for a long time. We all know that the actual identity of a successful athlete is someone who is hyper self-aware, aware of their body, aware of their mind, aware of what is required for them to go to the place they need to be, whether that's joining the right gym environment, whether that's artificially creating a nemesis, which we're seeing a lot now in powerlifting, just whatever they need to do to get to the place where they need to go to push themselves to the right amount for them. And I think that's even something that Brian spoke about. He's like, there's definitely such a thing as doing too much, and that person might need to do 6 sets, they might need to do 10, or they might need to do 4. And he was like, he even said this specifically, which is interesting because he comes from a thread that goes back to a highly dogmatic place in Arthur Jones of there is the one way to lift, which got even personified and pushed further by Mike Menser. And like, this is the philosophy. It's the only way to train. Anything else is suboptimal. Coming through that thread to hear Brian Dobson say, look, if there was one way to train, we'd all be doing it. Mm-hmm. There would be the chest workout, there'd be the back workout. I could tell you this, I've been around a long time, and he's 66, mind you, still doing the damn thing. And he says, that's not true. Like, there is something that everyone needs to do, but the one thing that holds everyone together is intensity. So, like, those things coexist, that there is an individual appropriate dose of intensity, even though intensity is required. And I think you see that slightly different in Ronnie. You see it slightly different in Branch. You see it slightly different in Arnold, like you were talking about. You see it very slightly different in Tom Platz, who interestingly, Brian Dobson remarked, is the only person he's ever seen legitimately fail on squats to the point where he gets pinned and lays on the ground and can't, and he sets up the rack prospectively to catch him when he knows he's going to fail on squats. So everyone's built a little bit different. That is a level of mental fortitude that is unnecessarily insane, I would say. But part of me still respects it.
I mean, he has the biggest legs, Tom Platz, and he did try. So Brian insinuated because he is trained with the beast of beasts that Tom perhaps, I'm not saying trained the hardest, like he did bring up Branch Warren, but those sets, he said no one else could do that, where he would go to absolute, like true failure, rest 6 to 7 minutes, he said, and go again, and then it'd be over in 30 minutes. But one thing I wanted to say quickly, Conor, to go back to two things, the self-awareness. Think about Ronnie, on top of the world, 8 Mr. Olympias, then he's runner-up next year. Then he makes the choice, and you could say, yes, like he had the back injuries, and maybe he just knew like his time was up. But the whole concept of winning and pushing yourself that much, if really we take it in the classical sense that people assume athletes to be, you would still try and grind it out, much like other sports stars. Like, you play in the NBA, you won your championships. Well, now you're 36. Like, you'll play for 3 more years. You're not playing nearly as good as you are, but you're hanging around. he hung up his, like, so to speak, his, let's say Speedo, and he knew the time had come. But one thing I want to come back to you very quickly, and I want to make a correction because, it will be for an upcoming YouTube video, but I said previously that it was a tragedy with Ronnie. Like, how tragic was it that the thing that he loved ended up hurting him and then impacting when the news broke and everything else. And he spoke about that concept. And I said about that, the concept, Conor, of like rugged masculinity, where we will not open up in terms of our pains and all those sorts of things. So we have to put on that stiff upper lip. Like, I do not regret anything. Regrets, I've had a few, but too few to remember type of thing, but like, who knows? Like, we have this incomplete knowledge. We don't know what's going to happen. And then when it happens, you do not know how you'll react because you do not know how you'll feel once that thing occurs. So I said that, but I actually want to change what I say. If we're talking about like tragic figures here, we're talking like mythological figures, that the thing that propelled him towards greatness is the same thing, that it's not a double-edged sword, but carried with it risks. And I think anyone that pushes themselves that hard is aware of that. It's not like there's, oh my God, I've been training 20 years and suddenly there's this freak accident and whoops, I had no idea. I think they know, and I think it's that same mindset of being hardcore when you said the pursuit of excellence with a certain recklessness in regards to one's health that's baked into it. So it's not that it's an inevitability, but it is a probability that is accepted. And as long as someone has that acceptance, so the idea you talk about, Eric, of, informed consent, and Ronnie really seems like he is comfortable with the choices, he's at peace with it, then it is a complete story. And so it is in no way, shape, or form a tragedy.
I'm going to reflect back to a competition I did in 2009. It was the NGA California. Big shout out to Johnny the Motivator. And the year prior to that, I watched Berto do the show. And I was listening to two enhanced bodybuilders who were coaching one of the other athletes. And some of the athletes had walked away. And I overheard this. And they basically said that, this is bodybuilding sort of, but clearly these guys aren't willing to do what's actually necessary. Like, they're by their definition, we weren't actually hardcore because we weren't willing to assume more risk. And I think, I don't agree with them because I defined myself as hardcore previously. But I think the difference is that everyone has a certain level of risk aversion, right? And I do think that natural bodybuilders on average are more risk averse. And wherever you're at in your life with however you evaluate the probability or whatever you're potentially willing to do, ideally you have some kind of accurate view of what the worst case scenario is, which is the value in stoicism, right? And you can think through that. And then you get to self-select and self-define what am I willing to risk and what probability of that risk occurring am I willing to take? And then from there, within that, then you act hardcore. You do it. Because then you can look in the mirror and say like, well, no, I'm not. That was silly. What that person did, I wouldn't do. And you can judge them just like I got judged and all my comrades got judged by it because we set the bar too low. And just like you hear in the natural community, they will judge the enhanced people like these guys are dying in their 40s. And we've talked about that. We've had all the episodes we did on the Washington Post series and the guests we've had who were part of that, the people who were there to actually try to save lives, being on the show, talking about it, who are involved in that scene. There's a wide range of what is acceptable. And I don't think you really can put an objective definition on what hardcore is. I think you can only say that, all right, you set the bar for yourself, you set the constraints, and then once you do, you better go.
If you just stopped wearing the Fitbit, people
would take that more. Well, Conor, let's put it another way.
It's
or maybe
a step counter.
With this. So, all right, Metroflex is like saying like fuck the police, okay? And what Eric is saying is that I do not approve of certain aspects of police misconduct. You're essentially saying the same thing in different ways, and you're both hardcore. Like, what's so different about that? Like, what? Like, yeah,
to just pull this back before we go down a rabbit hole that someone will have to edit out. I think something that you mentioned that we didn't actually talk about was Brian working with Nautilus at a certain point under Arthur Jones and getting into that intensity. Now,
I'm so glad you remembered that.
I'll let you fill that in a second. But you know, this idea of like informed consent and knowing what you're getting into. When you guys interviewed Brian, he'd literally duct taped effectively his hamstring because he had torn it. Yeah. But even Ronnie, when you look at, you know, the King, he talks about, you know, feeling something pop in his back doing front squats and then sort of figuring that out and working out to the best of his constraints. But, you know, his last Olympia where he loses to Jay, he had a very serious back injury. Like that was plaguing him at that point. And Brian said, like, I didn't know he was injured until like 6 months after the competition. Wouldn't have known. Like he changed his training a little bit, but I was like, okay, this is what we're doing now, I guess. But to have that and then go into the next year because he's trying to regain his Olympia, because Ronnie was the first time in a long time that the reigning champion had been defeated. It's a little bit different now because the field is a bit more competitive, regardless of, you know, how one defines that word. But like to have that injury and to try and reclaim it, and then the next year to go again when the injuries are starting to pile up and the pain is starting to pile up. It is a very interesting insight into that gym, and likewise Branch Warren. You know, in Generation Iron, people often remember it for the scene, and someone has huge respect for Branch. Like if you were directing Generation Iron, the horse kicking him off could not have been like, you know, you would turn to the guy filming and be like, you got that? Yeah, okay, and then you would run and check on Branch. Like, but you know, Branch again is someone who had those injuries and trained through it. Like it is a place where there's an acceptance of where they are and continuing on, and that is itself Tom Platz, but it's also powerlifting from the 70s and 80s. Besides, you want to talk about the Nautilus?
Yeah, just to kind of back up the whole difference between dogma and intensity. Look, so like you said, Brian Dobson worked at Nautilus, and he said those guys were actually mean. Like they believed, like if you did more than one, if they saw you doing more than one set, there would be actual potential physical consequences. What he made it sound like.
Just to cut in, so the Colorado experiment, which I'm not on TikTok, but I imagine that's like ready-made for content creators. If you look at stories of Arthur Jones training Casey Viator, like it goes beyond 3 more reps. It's like shouting at him, screaming at him, insulting him. Like at points, people say like Casey would have to be convinced to not stop the set, to attack. Like he was ready to attack Arthur Jones because this is Arthur things like you need to push no matter what, and I'm going to get you there by hook or by crook. Like there are training videos of Arthur and Bear Co on YouTube, and it's very like refined. Okay, we're going to do the pullover. Yeah, okay, you got 20 reps there. That's fine. But when you read stories of the Colorado experiment and what it was like when he was trying to like have those showpiece bodybuilders, you know, those showpiece transformations, like it got mean very fast. But sorry, continue.
Yeah, so if you know if that's the inheritance of Arthur Jones, so working in either the late 70s or early 80s, I couldn't really follow the exact timeline of where this was in Brian's life, but he's a young trainer working for Nautilus, is what I understood. And you know, step in if I'm not telling the story perfectly. 18 years old, so it would have been the 70s probably. Yeah. He waited until after the gym was closed, and then he would do his, I think he said 30 sets or whatever.
34. I know it's so weird, but
yeah, 34.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought he said 30, 40. Like he was getting
maybe
a range.
maybe.
But more than one.
More than one.
Yeah. And of course also to failure because, you know, that's what he was doing at that time. And he didn't buy into the dogma, but he did buy into the intensity.
Yep. And that's something that I think, as you said, there are all these different schools of thought, but at least, you know, when Brian was describing and being sort of magnanimous about, like, it doesn't need to be anything. And he talked about Ronnie's training program. He's like, I'll give anyone Ronnie's chest program from, like, you know, his Olympia days. Is like incline, flat, decline with a barbell on a Monday. On a Thursday, it was incline, flat, decline with dumbbells, which was so hilarious when you look at bodybuilding magazines from that era, because they'd be like, you know, I do it twice a day and we do blah, blah, blah. But that intensity being the through thread, and Brian himself needs a documentary because he just seemed to have this ability to meet all of these people, you know, in that sort of, like, you know, and the Tom Hanks movie. I'm not comparing Brian to Forrest Gump, but you know, this idea of Forrest being the one in all of these key places. Like Brian is just, when he was talking, because I've only ever gotten snippets of his life from reading around this, I was like, oh my God, like this man has met so many people and they've formulated his ideas about training, etc. And then he's passed that on formally and informally to all those other people. But intensity is, and it's actually maybe unfair in one sense to call Metroflex like hardcore. I think it is just intense. Like in a, I'm saying that in a positive way, not in a pejorative or insulting way.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, like you brought up earlier, there is a potential negative connotation to hardcore. I mean, it depends on where you're positioned. But, you say a hardcore gym to a natural bodybuilder and they're like, so is this where all the NPC guys train? And it is what it is. Like, okay, fine. But, it's going to be that, so they'll think that. Or to the average, person who's training where there's a lunk alarm, they're like, oh God, those guys, So I think that, an outsider absolutely would still think that about Metroflex, but someone who actually spent the time and talked to them, which we had the privilege and honor to do, we see like, oh, they're not exclusionary. They were happy to have, mothers, fathers, older people, whoever, just like, within your capacities and what's appropriate for your goals, put in the work.
What I respect, Eric, is that places like that were so necessary to allow the fermentation of new ideas within lifting. And we're like, oh, what do you mean lifting? Like a lot of things have been known, the basics, like, yeah, powerlifting. But the ability to even powerlift in a space, like I remember now, okay, so this is 20 years after Metroflex started. This is now far into the future. Lifting, the concept of doing a deadlift in a commercial gym, how it's looked down upon. I think how you gauge what is hardcore or intense, it's kind of based upon your thermometer and your accepted temperature. And for a lot of fitness or a lot of the industry in general, it is remarkably low. The mere fact that you want to use chalk can incense some people, right? Deadlift, like there were several gyms until I found Fortis Fitness. And we're talking now, so Fortis Fit, we're talking 25 years after Metroflex. So the idea that, it's places like a Metroflex or these other places that allow you to express oneself in the fermentation of these ideas that then permeates the general space and keeps it alive. It's almost like a torch that you're keeping lit, and then it is disseminated to the masses. And now in 2023, thanks to many different factors, you're allowed to lift in a variety of different ways that is accepted. And it is thanks in no small part to places like Metroflex for allowing people to once again express themselves in a certain capacity.
Yeah, and something to that, I think in the last episode I mentioned like the value of YouTube or the importance of YouTube in that. Like Brian mentioned some iconic things that come from Metroflex. Branch doing dips with chains around his neck, Ronnie doing the walking lunges with like the barbell on his back, etc. But you're right, I think especially in bodybuilding, there's always been a disconnect between the elite competition, which still exists today, versus the lifestyle of bodybuilding. But what people don't seem to understand sometimes is, yes, they are two different worlds, but the lifestyle bodybuilding or bodybuilding as lifestyle is subtly and like imperceptibly nudged in certain directions by that elite level, by that intensity, by those hardcore places. And then the things are repackaged and, put together. And Brian made a very funny comment about, like now you see people wear dipping with chains. It's basically like a light bike lock, sometimes so sometimes it goes the other way and it's sort of watered down and washed out. But there is that, I suppose, tension between mainstream fitness and then these hardcore places, but they do meet in the middle oftentimes for the better. Like, my first gym had one squat rack. No one really used it. There was nowhere to deadlift, certainly no platforms, etc. Dumbbells went 30 kilos, etc. But like, it's when those two worlds, I think, meet, that's where there's a net positive for the general public, because it just gives them more options, which is what fitness should be.
Well, I think it's because they share the central thing that's important. I made the mistake of early on in my career, wanting to seek an identity, feel special, and I was uncomfortable with the idea of someone calling themselves a bodybuilder if they hadn't competed like I did, and I do have some regrets, and that's one of them. Saying that and having that perspective, because I also had a pretty crappy perspective at that point that I, to my own credit, when I spoke it out loud, I identified it. And I've told this story before, but I said to my wife sometime in 2007, and during my first contest prep, if I didn't think I could become Mr. Natural Olympia, I don't think I would train. And I immediately was like, no, training is what I like. It's not competing. This has become something that is getting away from me. And what is the unifying thing between recreational and competitive bodybuilders, lifestyle bodybuilders, and Ronnie Coleman, the elite level, and just anybody who is infatuated with training, is that they're training hard. And then if you can then unify them around a core principle, which is what's present in a hardcore gym of intensity, or an intense gym, if we want to use that terminology for Metroflex, that is probably part of the reason why Ronnie fell in love with training and then got into bodybuilding, and why, okay, my bodybuilding's career over, that's not that big of a deal because I'm still going back to training. And the only tragedy, if there is one here, is people who don't have that, in my opinion. And it can look like something different. We've talked to a number of people, like Mike Zerdos, for example. Shout out to Dr. Z. He, honestly, so in my life, if you were to ask me who is the hardest training person you've ever seen, easily Mike Zerdos. He squatted for 4 months straight to a max on squats every single day. And I do mean 10 RPEs. And like, what do you say to that? And did back offsets too, you know? His bench suffered, you know, and he looks back and he'll tell you that he also has some injuries from it. And today, what does he do? He actually runs marathons. He doesn't lift weights anymore. But I know it's still the same Mike Zerdos, and I know he's getting the same thing out of that. And I know before he got into lifting, he played soccer, and I'm sure he played soccer the same way. So it is actually going all the way back to physical culture of the core element of who you are, or one of the core elements. I'll say an essential piece to who you are, something that can't be let go of, is finding some way to train. And then that is an element of how you identify and what you need in life to feel fulfilled. And that is clearly something that Ronnie did, and he found an outlet in bodybuilding, but bodybuilding didn't subsume that. So the only tragedy is when people let that outlet change and subvert that initial love, which can happen. And we've talked about the research on that and how extrinsic motivation can threaten that if you are not self-aware about this. And I think that's one thing, is Ronnie never lost that. Even though he's the pinnacle of the sport, 8 Olympias, he gets bested by a rival, he's hurt. You know, someone who is far more insecure and didn't have that self-awareness might feel, oh, my philosophy was bankrupt. I'm not the man I thought I was. I got beat by Jay. And, you know, just collapsed from it. And, you know, he had a rough year in 2006. You could see it on stage and everything, but he came back the next year. And one thing I always do remember, and this gave me a lot more respect for Ronnie as well, he placed 4th in the 2007 Olympia. And he was incredibly, and honestly, it looked very genuine, gracious to be on stage, shook everyone's hand. And it was night and day to him feeling probably robbed in 2006 because he was going for that I want to beat Lee Haney. Mm-hmm. But that was something he just took in stride eventually, as we understood in our interview. You know, he said, you know what, I didn't beat Lee Haney's record, but I tied him, and I'm pretty happy with that. And I think that was a genuine thing. And even just the next year, he was able to go, you know what, he presented gratitude. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for that.
And it's funny you do raise that point of like not being subsumed by it. So I think if you looked at Ronnie Train, or like, you know, even hear some of Brian's anecdotes, or, you know, look at Branch Train, or even just some of the people in that gym train, like, quite frankly, I've never seen so many people just getting at it all at once, you know, like they're usually the outlier. You would expect that they're like, hardcore is their identity. And this is someone who like I can't turn off my like humanities brain. So, you know, you look at motivational videos, or you look at like YouTube videos, sometimes it is that like going to war with the weights, etc. And they try and turn this into like an all subsuming identity. But like Omar, Brian's talking to you about baseball, like he has that very strong Christian faith. Ronnie has a very strong Christian faith. He was a full-time police officer for, you know, a great deal, if not the entirety of his career. Big J is saying, you know, fitness is like my side hustle, you know, like I have my own company. Again, very strong faith. So it's interesting that they were able to compartmentalize these things, that it didn't become that through thread, which I think is oftentimes very unhealthy. It's the like, you know, The Wrestler, the movie, you know, where it's this all or nothing. Without this, I don't know who I am. And they all have that love of training. So there is a little bit of this, like, without this, I don't know who I am. But it doesn't spill into the rest of their lives. And they're very clear, not in a preaching sense, but just very comfortable with that idea of, I go in, I do the work with the intensity that's needed, but I am a full person outside of this. And for someone like Ronnie, when you say like magnanimous, especially when you look at the next decade after that, like when Kai and Phil are, you know, fighting on stage, and there's a lot of ill will in bodybuilding in that Kai and Phil era. And you have Ronnie, who, you know, was a reigning Olympia. It had been a long time since the reigning Olympia had been defeated. He was going for his 9th. Very magnanimous the next year, very magnanimous in his final year at the Olympia. And it is just fascinating to see a lot of the subconscious, you know, perceptions I had of Metroflex going in there, and then talking to these people and going, Oh, there is actually a lot of nuance to how you understand and position training in your lives and in who you are as people.
I think maybe to wrap this up, I want to share, and I want to hear from you guys, maybe a particular memory or a story or a moment or something. I'll share a funny one to lighten up a little bit, because you did bring up lunges, and I have to, like, not to spoil the documentary, but
it's worth it. It's worth it.
Yeah, this is what I love about some of the logic applied. It operates under like dream logic, where it doesn't rationally make sense, but there's some kernel somewhere where it does, and that's completely fine.
And Brian even acknowledged that
Yes.
too. He was like, "Was this a fever dream?"
Yeah. And so Brian, so he had witnessed before in magazines that there were women doing walk-in lunges, like all these Shape magazine in particular, thank you, and they had really great glutes. Okay, so that was the start of something. And then he wanted to hunt a bear, but he goes hunting. And then while he was hunting and while he was doing the activity, he had an epiphany where the movement that he needed to do to better prepare him in order to hunt a bear was the exercise he saw in Shape magazine that women were doing to get muscular glutes. And that is basically, am I representing his story correctly?
Yeah. So he stated that he had to go up this hill to get to where the bear was, right? And below that, the animals wouldn't go up there. Brian is a great storyteller. Even though it's circuitous, he covers a lot of content, and you get a good sense, right? So he's like, oh, I have to get up this hill, and oh man, I'm stepping up these hills. My glutes are really sore. I need to, next time I go out hunting, I need to be prepared for this. Well, let me try doing those lunges, because that would help me, get up something. And where am I going to do it? Well, I can just do it in the parking lot of Metroflex. And I put 135 on, and I did it, and that wasn't that hard.
Yeah. 3 times he did it, and then the next day, that soreness. But where did he get that idea from? And how did he think it was going to apply? And then he's like, I'm going to do it. But the willingness, I think, to try things and to be unconventional, right? I think that's maybe not like a fourth element of being like hardcore, but it's outside the norm, right? Like the normal logic of what applies in society is not applying in this place. So maybe, I don't know if you guys want to share like any particular stories or anything. That just, as soon as you brought up lunges, like, boom, entered.
Actually, I think I'm going to piggyback off the lunges, because Brian was like, well, I walked down to the street and back. And like usually when someone does like walking lunges, like, okay, maybe like 12, 15, like maybe like 20 steps.
Like 100 or something.
It was like 100. So he was like, yes, I walked down the end of the street. I did a double take. I was like, I mean, we've been driving like a minute into this car park to get in here. So I think that was number one. Number two, I think it was really cool for me to see Joseph's enthusiasm to see Ronnie train. And I know Joseph, like Carson time, I was shocked when he told me he was 17. I was like, this is way too emotionally mature and cool a guy and like passionate a guy who's doing what he loves. But like seeing him have that, like, oh my God, he's getting after it. This is amazing. But also there was another guy who's a member of Metroflex who's doing his own documentary for his high school, and looking at him film Ronnie as well, and the like joy and enthusiasm in his eyes. And he is now going to be sharing that in his high school. Like it was very cool to see younger generations, especially in a time of like it's so temporal in fitness at the moment, like hero for a day, forgotten for forever, etc. Yes. And there are so many different archetypes that people can look up to. It was really cool to see younger people looking at Ronnie training now the way I looked at Ronnie training when I was like of a comparable age.
Yeah, I think the one I want to share is actually something that to go back to giving credit to Big J, because this wouldn't have happened without him. And his story of how he met Ronnie and how they first had their experience of training together. And he was, reasonably strong at this time, but it was, I think, decades ago. And he was squatting, I think, in the 500s. And he was doing like doubles and triples, that powerlifting influence. And Ronnie was giving him this stank look, like, and eventually he was like, what's up? And he's like, why are you just doing doubles and triples? You need to drop the weight and start doing like higher rep sets. And his legs blew up. So it speaks to the fact that, okay, this is Ronnie Coleman, clearly, before he was even competing, he's going to be that guy in the gym, right? And there's this young fellow, or maybe just less experienced. I don't actually remember the age gap between him, or even if he might be older than Ronnie. Same age. Same age. Okay, there you go. But the willingness to go and just help out another member, and I think that speaks to who Ronnie is, and I think it's also nice to just kind of end on that, where we're paying some respect to the man Big J who made this happen. So yeah, I thought that was really cool, and it was good to hear that Ronnie, that's that part of that impression I got of Ronnie wasn't the king of the Metroflex community. He was a member of the community, helping others and making sure that everybody actually had that core piece of what they believed was critical.
Man, I have to give, the biggest shout out to everyone, to Big J, to Brian Dobson, to Metroflex, to Ronnie Coleman, obviously, for granting us the interview and being so gracious with his time. It's very interesting to me how, we went to Sheffield early on in the year, which is a contemporary thing that occurred, that who knows how it will reverberate through time. So it was cool to witness a moment in history, and then how will it be chronicled? Who knows, right? And then it's also equally and in different ways utterly fascinating to meet up with a legend like Ronnie, who already his impact has been known, and then to try and extrapolate into the future, where we talk about the next generation of Joseph and the other group of kids doing their high school documentary, and almost like we talk about the temporal nature of fitness and how it's like baked into the industry. But it's almost reassuring, not that you can escape your mortality or like become immortal, or like any of these things, but like Ronnie has had such a big impact that he's almost punched above that concept, that notion that you're confined to a time and place, and it's extending and truly reverberating now through time. So that's just cool to see. Like Joseph was so excited to be there. Those kids, the same idea. The next generation already gets it. So his influence is now spanning decades upon decades.
He's connecting people. Like, I'm 40, Joseph is 17. I felt like we were about the same level of giddy. Yeah. And I think that's kind of cool. I'm more than twice his age. So I think that speaks to the impact that Ronnie has had. And I just want to give a big shout out and thank you to that whole crew. So,
anything you fellas want to say in closing before we wrap it up? Thank you. This has been the Hardcore Iron Culture podcast. Yeah. We have a few ground rules. We'll establish that in another episode. But needless to say, we're here to find our tribe and not play by anyone's rules. But if you want to play by our rules, you could go ahead and leave a rating and review and do the hardcore thing, which is to give 5 stars. We're now telling you what to do, because that's once again what we do. We don't ask questions, we give you the answers, and 5 stars is what we want to hear. We will see everyone. We appreciate you truly for listening to this episode, for participating in this. We'll see you every insert date here from now until the end of time. Toodles.